the saving of Cleo stands out because so few abductions end so happily. None of us can look at the parents of a missing child and not see the unspeakable anguish and that mixture of grief and fear and desperate hope in their eyes. Abductors can still run, but they're finding it harder to hide. I'm Andrew Rule, this is Life and Crimes. This week, Melbourne Cup Week, a very big story dominates the news, and that is one of the few good news stories that we get to talk about. That, of course, is the finding of little Cleo Smith in Carnarvon in Western Australia. Now, the relief for Cleo's parents, for her mother, her stepfather and her natural father, and of course, her extended family. That relief was shared with millions of strangers like us across Australia and to some extent across the world, as early bulletins aired one of the most moving good news stories, I think, since the Thai cave rescue in 2018 and the Beaconsfield mine disaster in Tasmania back in 2006. It had something of that shared quality. Complete strangers were moved to tears by a happy result to something that most of us had assumed was already a tragedy. But there's one person, maybe more than one, 2 or 3 people, who should be very rattled by the miracle of Cleo Smith in the West. And that would be the person or the people behind the sinister disappearance of the people we call the Wonangatta campers, Russell Hill and Carol Clay, up in the Victorian High Country back in March last year, right at the start of the pandemic. Now, there's no literal link between these two cases, which are separated by 20 months and 4,000 kilometres and the Nullarbor Plain. But there is a connection in an abstract way between the way Cleo's abduction has been investigated and the way the Victorian detectives, missing persons specialists, have searched for potential offenders the week the campers vanished. Now, to be blunt about the Cleo Smith case, the West Australian Police have overcome years of getting big cases wrong by getting this one so right. Cleo's rescue is a textbook example of modern investigation for a textbook that's still being written. The fact that this little 4-year-old girl was found alive and well is not all down to police efficiency over 18 days, good as it was. Her welfare, the fact she's alive and apparently healthy, has more to do with the motives and the mental issues of whoever abducted her, which is something that a court will determine. But it's clear that the tracing of Cleo to a rundown house in a rundown street in Carnarvon, right up north in Western Australia, is a blueprint for police in future abductions everywhere. And some of the techniques they use to find her and to boil down the potential pool of suspects have been used for sure to single out suspects for the Wonangatta mystery. Now, of course, there's a basic difference between the two cases that explains why Cleo's disappearance was tackled so much more urgently than the one here in Victoria. And that is clearly because Russell Hill and Carol Clay were pension-age adults, both in their 70s, camping in a remote area in 1 million acres of wild bush, and so their disappearance wasn't immediately treated as if it were sinister. For a start, no one knew that they disappeared for many hours. And when it was realised that their camp was abandoned and that there'd been a fire and so on, It was reasonable to assume at first that this pair might have got lost in the bush, that they'd taken a drone, followed it when it crashed somewhere in the bush and had managed to get lost and perish, as many people have in the high country over the decades. And in fact, that was a theory that I personally favoured for the first week of the search for the Wanangata couple. But gradually the facts asserted themselves and suggested otherwise, which is why when the Missing Persons Unit eventually became involved and the focus of the search for Mr. Hill and Ms. Clay changed. Of course, when a child as young as Cleo, just 4 years old, or someone as young as William Tyrrell or Daniel Morecambe, when they vanish, it demands attention and it sparks instant and intelligent action, or at least it should. None of us can look at the parents of a missing child and not see the unspeakable anguish and that mixture of grief and fear and desperate hope in their eyes. The world saw that all over again in the days after Cleo vanished overnight from a tent at the family's campsite about an hour's drive north of Carnarvon exactly 3 weeks ago. For the world media and the national media, it had everything. It had shades of Azaria Chamberlain, the baby snatched from a tent near Uluru by a dingo in 1980. It also reminded people of the world-famous Maddie McCann case, in which a little British girl was abducted from a Portuguese hotel in 2007. She, of course, has never been found. At the Blowholes campsite north of Carnarvon on October the 16th this year, police suspected from the start that this simply wasn't another lost child. The tent zip had been undone to a height higher than little Cleo could reach. Her sleeping bag was also gone, which would seem to suggest that she'd been carried away by someone big enough to carry her. It's fair to presume too that police did not find small bare footprints or anything that would suggest she'd wandered off. It was a race against time and a totally unknown abductor. Now, while locals threw themselves into a painstaking search directed by a big number of police who arrived en masse from Perth and elsewhere, detectives set about eliminating relatives as suspects, as they have to do always in these cases. But they had to do that without losing sight of the chance that this was a random, opportunistic act. We all know the statistics when something bad happens to a child or something bad happens in a family. Mostly, 7 or 8 times out of 10, it'll be someone known to the family or someone in the family that is connected to that crime. But when children are abducted, that's not always the case. It's just mostly the case. Underlining this sense of urgency in the West was the speed with which the state government over there announced a $1 million reward. The reward showed that the authorities, instead of being years behind in trying to find someone with old information, they were totally invested from the first vital few hours, those golden hours that an investigation needs if it's going to be successful. A police task force was set up pretty well overnight. Its members were ace investigators. They identified potential leads by using every method at their disposal, almost from the jump. First, they had to establish who was near the campsite that night, and then find out why any of those people did not come forward to clear themselves. Now, We've seen this alluded to in the media over the 18 days that Cleo was missing. They used satellites, they used sophisticated federal police capabilities to monitor telephone networks and so on. Clearly the sort of technology that is used to monitor terrorist cells and that sort of stuff. They also did the hard yards on the ground with extremely thorough searches for any tiny clue. The saving of Cleo stands out because so few abductions end so happily. In the television age, in which nearly all of us have grown up now, abduction cases become part of the folklore because the camera captures these compelling and unforgettable images of innocent victims and of their tormented families. We soon think that we know them, the Chamberlains and all the others that are at the centre of these cases. Speaking of the television age, the first kidnapping for ransom in Australia was that of a little boy called Graeme Thorne in Sydney in 1960. This is just 4 years after television was introduced in Australia. There was no good reason for the kidnapper, a man who called himself Stephen Bradley, which wasn't the name he was born with. There was no good reason for this man to kill the boy whose parents had won the Opera House lottery, but he did it anyway. No doubt he did it because he thought that with a 9-year-old, there was the chance that the boy would be able to recognise him later. Any attempt to disguise himself probably would have been enough that he could have kept the little boy alive and released him after the ransom was paid, but that apparently is not how the criminal mind works. Often abducted people are killed because of the supreme selfishness of those who do the abduction. The Beaumont Children probably stands above all the other abduction cases in Australia. That is the three Beaumonts, Jane, Anna and Grant, who vanished from Glenelg Beach in Adelaide back in January 1966. That crime still haunts us because no sign of those children was ever found, and none of the various suspects looked at over the years has ever been arrested for it. The uncomfortable truth, mostly ignored, is that the investigation was handicapped from the start because most detectives on that long weekend were either on leave or drinking at Australia Day barbecues. In fact, police privately admitted later that the sketch artist who drew a supposed likeness of a suspect in the Beaumont case, this was a thin, blonde young man who'd been seen with the children at Glenelg Beach. The artist who drew this likeness was so drunk that the drawing looked more like a Martian than a human. The truth is that investigation of many other abduction cases has been hampered because suburban police just don't take another lost kid or runaway, as they see it, seriously until it's too late. The list is long, but some names still stand out. I'll never forget the case of the Makai Sisters, those little girls abducted and murdered in Townsville in 1970 when I was a young schoolboy. It was a mystery until 1988 when a tip-off from a family member led to a wiry old man called Arthur Stanley Brown, who avoided being charged with the sisters' murders after taking legal advice that he was too demented to plead. Some believe that Brown, who travelled regularly interstate by himself back in the 70s and 80s, matched the description of the thin man wearing a broad-brimmed hat seen carrying and dragging two girls near the Adelaide Oval in 1973. Those two girls were undoubtedly Joanne Ratcliffe and Kirsty Gordon. Joanne was 11, Kirsty was 4. They were never seen again. We'll never know if it was Arthur Brown, but the description is compelling. In Melbourne, in more recent times, 10 years ago, the disappearance of Bung Siraboon as she walked to school on June the 2nd, 2011, has never looked like being solved. One reason for this, probably, is that because Bung was a teenager, she was 13, local police initially dismissed her as just another runaway. And it's understandable because suburban police, week in, week out, will be contacted by families who are anxious about some school kid who didn't come home from school or whatever. And, almost inevitably, they turn up within hours or days. But the odd one doesn't. That's where it is a tragedy. But little Cleo Smith, is only 4 years old. She's not 14. And when she vanished only a few metres from where her mother and her stepfather were sleeping, it was enough to alarm even the most sceptical police. What happened next matters. The scene was quarantined properly for forensic experts. The task force, named Rhodia, was set up to investigate as thoroughly as if this was already a murder, not just a lost kid. Now, such swift and concentrated action is not the way it happened in many of the cases that stick in our memories. To be fair, of course, modern police have far better tools than their predecessors did. Once, and by this I mean last century, if there were no eyewitnesses or fingerprints, investigators had not much to go on but tips, hunches, door knocking and aggressive interviewing of potential or possible suspects. And this would usually be people with a bit of form for the sort of crime that's under investigation. Therefore, if it's a missing child, they would be looking at child sex offenders and so on. Rewards in the past, if and when posted, were nearly always too little and too late. But this time, the West Australian government stepped up and played the $1 million reward card early. No doubt calculating that the lure of big money might loosen the tongues of people who could normally avoid talking to police at all, let alone tell them the truth. But the police had some other tricks in their kit. And I don't mean the underhand sort of tricks that have led to at least 3 innocent men being wrongly jailed for murder in Perth over recent decades. These days, police have mobile phone records and mobile phone use is almost universal. Everybody at every level, every station of life, in every corner of Australia has a mobile phone. There's dash cam on cars, which has become very popular. There are security cameras of various sorts, which record people or cars passing by different places, far more than there ever were once. There are cashless electronic transactions. There's even litter. Now, there's always been litter, but these days police can search and find things that have been dropped, thrown away, and depending what it is, they might be able to find DNA or fingerprints. They might even be able to find identifying branding, such as date stamps or serial numbers, things that might isolate a particular packet or item to a district or to a store or to a time of sale. All these things can point in one direction. Abductors can still run, but they're finding it harder to hide once police concentrate all their big guns and all their modern techniques on the search for the guilty. You can't blame the Western Australian police for being fairly self-congratulatory this week. It was a magnificent thing to find a little girl alive and apparently so well that she's sitting up in hospital, smiling, waving. It just is, as one detective said, the best thing he's ever done in his career. And we all feel for her. But as one senior officer said over there when he was interviewed about it, he said, it's a matter of piecing it through. I think he means piecing it together. He said it's a matter of piecing it through, working out who was where at the wrong time. Those words are worth remembering. Who was where at the wrong time. The smart money says that is how the Wonnangatta mystery will also be solved. But it probably won't have a happy ending. Thanks for listening. Life and Crimes is a Sunday Herald Sun production for True Crime Australia. Our producer is John Burton. And if you want to know more about these stories, links are in the description of this episode.